So, dear Hartmut, we know each other for 10 years or so already.
Yeah, something like that.
Something like that. I wrote my thesis with you, and of course I've read your work. But I thought it was interesting to start by asking you about your childhood, youth, the circumstances, maybe the village you were born, and your first interest, maybe music or this or that, in order to understand how all that led you eventually to becoming a political thinker, a social thinker. So.
Yeah, that's it is actually quite interesting because it's always a lot of things which come together, right? I mean, I grew up in the Black Forest, in a small village there, right, in the mountains at the very southwestern tip of Germany.
Yeah,
and in a very simple conditions, right? I have rather something like a working class background, but my parents were a bit unusual because they were very adventurous in religious terms, right? The village is Catholic, of course, but they left the Catholic Church. Yeah. Because my mother thought, well, what the priest is telling us cannot be the truth. And then they experimented with different forms of religion, including Hinduistic groups and so on. So I don't know, I think I got a sense of diversity and even maybe of multiculturalism through that a bit. But then I started to study. I started to study in Freiburg, which is close by, right? It's university. And then I thought, okay, but you cannot stay there forever. So I went as an undergraduate to London for 1 year, right, at the London School of Economics.
How old were you?
I was about 20 or so, 19, 20, something like that. And I think it was really the difference. I think I do remember quite well that I thought it's such a different way of being in the world, right? Of living your life in the big city in London, which I enjoyed very much, right? Sometimes I thought it was there that I really became a kind of subject, right? And in the Black Forest, which is the small village, and the relation, and I think this somehow brought me to thinking about time and the way we relate to the world as such, right? I mean, I love the mountains, and because you see them from the southern Black Forest, you see the whole chain of the Alpine mountains, right, the Alps. And I also liked watching the stars. I do to this very day, right? And that's just a different way of connecting to of being in the world than from the big city.
I understand that you have a telescope.
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
House.
Finally,
So
finally, I actually my godchild actually built me together with his father a small observatory, and I like watching, even watching stars.
And you also like music. I know.
Yeah, totally.
You have played.
Yeah, we had a heavy rock band. I mean, I really think, I told you my parents were quite religious, and actually they were very conservative. It was more Hinduistic than anything other, but it was a bit. It had a lot of this ascetic, Puritanist, almost fundamentalist thinking. So no joy, totally ascetic, and rock music was my way out. Really, I got into with my whole existence. I delved into, for example, Pink Floyd, The Wall. When I was 16 or so, I knew every line. I could quote the whole album from beginning to start.
By heart.
But totally by heart, exactly. And I wrote one of my papers, one of my essays, one of my final essays at the Freiburg University was on Pink Floyd and the role of art and that kind of stuff. Right? But I also liked, for some reason, as I told you, I did not grow up Christian, but I was totally addicted to the church organ. Whenever I heard an organ play somewhere, I somehow felt I had to go in there and stay there. So to this day I sometimes play church organ, but I play rock music on the church organ, which actually sounds amazingly good. People like it.
Okay, I think this will be important for the last part of the conversation, and your last part of the work. But first I want to ask you, so you're a political theorist, right?
Yeah, well,
and then sociology. You turn into sociology.
Yes, that's right. I started my study in philosophy and political theory and also literature because I thought I wanted to go into philosophy, but at that time I thought literature is the better form of philosophy when you really want to get at what life is about and what is essential to human
experiences.
Beings. Yes, experiences. It's much more true to life than this total abstract way of thinking. And when I was studying in Freiburg, I was close to giving up on philosophy because there it was all Heidegger. Martin Heidegger was very strong, but also Kant and the Greeks. And I felt this is so far away from things which really interest me that I probably would have given it up. had it not been for the London School of Economics, there I encountered Charles Taylor's thinking, really. I remember that very well. I mean, the first two pieces I read by him were Neutrality in Political Science and Self-Interpreting Animals.
Yeah, this very famous paper by Taylor.
The philosophical papers. And this, I thought, well, this is exactly where I want to go to, right? What I want to do. And so when I came back, I specialized in political science and political theory. And then I wrote my dissertation on Charles Taylor.
Yeah.
But then I somehow got into, the critical theory tradition, and that always tried to kind of to overcome these strong divisions and to do a kind of social theory which bridges philosophy, psychology, political science, and sociology.
Exactly. What was most important for you about Taylor that allowed you to continue your work, your path?
Yeah. I mean, I think. I did start with the methodological stuff, right? This self-interpretation seemed to me very important, right? That we are, at least in some way, in some sense, how we understand ourselves, right? And but then that opened the way to what, for example, Taylor's concept of strong evaluations I found very interesting, right? With the idea that we have a sense which is not always articulate. It's very often innate, and we acquire it in practices of what the point of life really is, right? What is life about, and what are the most important things? And he opened the horizon to say, well, different cultures and in historical times, different segments of society do it in different ways, and it's very interesting to reconstruct these ways, these implicit
from history, from culture,
through history and through culture, but also through everyday life. I mean, it was also. I mean, apart from the contents, I really liked Taylor's style of writing, right? I mean, and this kind of deliberating. I mean, I actually recently went back to this methodologically, what he calls the best account principle, right? Trying to give the best possible account by drawing on all sources. I mean, Taylor draws on literature,
absolutely.
Like I do too. Yeah. And thereby kind of finding an articulation of our moral map, of our horizon and of our self-understanding.
That's right.
This way of doing it.
That's right.
Very attractive.
And Taylor, as we know, his main book, The Sources of the Self, he's working out the modern identity, what would be. So he's a... And I think that the social science, from the beginning, the number one phenomenon they were trying to study was modernity itself, right?
Yes.
Would you agree with that?
I agree with that. I mean, particularly sociology, of course.
Exactly. So I wanted to turn into that direction and hear your take on modernity, but maybe I could contextualize in this interview something you also write in your works. Like, for example, if you take Marx, he gives all the emphasis on production, right? On productive processes. Yeah. So modernity, we could say for Marx, is equated with the process of domestication, you say, or control of nature, commodification, you could also say. And then we can turn into the other classics of sociology, like Weber, for example, who thought modernity was a rationalization process. That is, you could see in modern science, in the spread of instrumental reason, secularization, I would say as well, bureaucratization, right? So these are modern processes. Simmel would go for a more individualistic culture that characterizes modernity, and Mary Durkheim, of course, is modernity could be thought as an intense process of division of work, functional differentiation of spheres, etc. So I wanted to ask you, as I said, what is your particular take on modernity, and what do you share with this classic diagnosis?
Yeah, I mean, I think they all got, of course, very important points, right? I don't think that any of those great founding fathers of sociology, right, made bad mistakes or so. I mean, when I teach it, I like to teach Introduction to Social Theory.
Yeah, I know.
I really get enthusiastic about all of them because I think they all get something right. And I think, I mean, in my understanding, it's really that I try to see what is the kind of, where do those diagnoses meet, right? What is their kind of the core almost of, as you say, with the process of rationalization, individualization, functional differentiation, and domestication. What's the common denominator?
Yeah.
And that's a bit how I arrived at my own definition and my work on acceleration, right? Well, the idea was then that what combines these different strands of thinking or of analyzing modern society is that it somehow changes the fabric of time, the temporal structures of modern society. That's how I got at the issue, because I thought, well, or maybe you could also make the point somewhat differently, saying that what we missed in sociology and social theories of modernity was exactly this temporal dimension, because we then thought, when you turn to the second generation of sociologists, also like Parsons or Luhmann or Habermas or so, then you really think that modernization is rationalization or differentiation, for example, right? But I think the early thinkers had this sense of that it was also kind of what I now call dynamization of the world, right? For example, Marx, of course, for Marx it's pretty obvious when in Marx and Engels in their famous Communist Manifesto, right? They have this. When you read that or reread it, you find it's a theory of setting the world in motion almost, right? Through the logic of capital and capital reproduction. They say the bourgeoisie is driven all over the earth and is forced to make this society anew all the time until they reach at this famous line, until all that is solid melts into air. Yeah. And with Max Weber, it's very interesting when you look at the Protestant ethics. It's not just an ethics about saving money or so. It's an ethics of time. Don't waste time. I mean, he quotes Benjamin Franklin that remember that time is money. Yeah. Right. And he also quotes Baxter saying that wasting time is the deadliest of sins for the Protestants. Right.
This disciplination of time.
Yeah. Exactly. The everyday, the asceticism of everyday life is don't waste any time and don't stay in bed for too long. Right? It's permanently working hard and so on. And for Simmel, when he defines the metropolitan life, and it was my experience of London, right, when I went there. He says the heart of metropolitan life is this is the nervousness of it, right? That it increases vastly the number of simulations per. But I think it was a long process. I then tried to analyze the temporality of modernity and claiming that modernity is really about speeding up life, but also speeding up the world. It's literally setting the world in motion. Right? I really love this idea that aliens might visit us down here, right? And when they watch us since the 18th century, they would really observe the dynamization of the world with the steamships, with the railways, with the cars, even with the velos, the bicycles in the streets, and the subways and all of this. And then with the airplanes, right? As we speak right here, there are 2 million people up in the air. And then you have the flows of capital and of ideas and of images, so it's setting the world in motion to a large extent. But then the question is why? I mean, what's driving this? And so I arrive at my own definition of modernity as a process, or I rather speak of the process of modernization, which means that a society is modern when its mode of stabilization is dynamic. That is to say, it needs growth, economic growth, technological acceleration, and cultural innovation all the time. Just in order to keep its institutional structure, right? We are forced to keep this dynamization going in order to keep the economic system, but also the welfare system.
Exactly. And so on. What is the difference between the acceleration thesis per se and this second thesis, which is the dynamic stabilization of modern societies?
I mean, when I looked at, I mean, there is a clear connection. I think it's a kind of contradiction, right? But when I wrote the acceleration book, I was interested in looking. Can I really measure the speeding up of society? And my answer was yes, because there are 3 dimensions of it: technological acceleration, the speeding up of transport, production, and communication, the speeding up of the rates of change themselves, the speeding up of social change. The world does not stay the same. And the acceleration of the pace of life. We try to do more things per unit of time, right? So I try to analyze this and also the consequences this has for individual identities, for politics, for the possibility of democracy. But then I turned towards asking myself, well, what is driving, what's propelling this thing?
Exactly.
And then I realized that it's not so much the idea of going beyond it. I mean, we are not, at least in the late modern age, we are not driven by this idea. We want to grow and accelerate and speed up, but we have to in order to keep our status quo. And then I found that this was a later insight, why I call it dynamic stabilization, that we are driven by the desire. I mean, it's not a desire, it's a necessity to keep what we have, right? I mean, just to stay where we are. I mean, on the macro level. Right? A country like Chile or Germany, right? We need economic growth, and you achieve this through permanent innovation and education and activation and all of this, right?
There is no alternative to that.
That's the China idea, right? In modernity, it's this is structurally very. I think it's the iron cage Weber writes about, right?
You give this image, which is very graphic, not trying to climb a slippery slope.
Exactly.
No? You're trying to climb it,
but the slope comes down.
Exactly.
Yes.
So if you don't keep moving, you will go down afterward.
And this logic then attracted me, right? I mean, it's a kind of shift in attention that I realized this is the way we keep what we have. That's why I call it dynamic stabilization, or I call it frenetic standstill, right? You have to run faster and faster just to stay in place.
Exactly.
And this I find is very unique, and I would say it's kind of crazy.
That's very interesting.
It's very irrational.
And what is behind? I mean, why suddenly modern society started to work under this logic? What is it? There are cultural factors, structural factors. What?
I mean, that's the thing. I mean, on the one hand, you could actually just answer it with Marx, right? And to say that it's the logic of capital accumulation, right? The logic of money, commodity, money prime, MC, M prime, which keeps the system going, because the economic activity is only taking place if there is a promise of realizing the prime, i.e., some form of profit or gain or increase, right? So it's the logic of capital accumulation, one could say. But it really is my conviction, and I think this is something I of course then took from Taylor, who says, well, it's never just the production, right? It's also the self-interpretation. There must be a culture. And that's what I always say. I mean, my main take really is that it's not systems which produce innovation and even accelerate, right, or achieve growth. It's us, the human subjects. So something must be driving us culturally. There must be a promise to this, and also the fears might be connected to. I mean, fear is easy. We are driven by the fear of losing our jobs and losing our place in the world and our income and everything if we don't run. But I agree with Charles Taylor, who would say that no culture, no social formation, as I call it, can survive in the long run if there is not also some form of promise, right? I mean, Boltanski and Chapella would make the same point, right?
A narrative, would you say, as well?
A narrative, yes, it's a narrative, but I think
narrative.
It's not all narrative. Narratives are important. But I try to get at the promises. What is the idea of the good life, basically, that's driving us? Right?
Motivations.
The motivation, and that's why I say we are motivated on the one hand by fear, right, of losing out in competition, but on the other hand by what I call the AAA approach to the good life, right?
That's good.
It's this promise that we make the world available, accessible, and attainable. And I think you see it on the macro level as on the micro level. I mean, that's driving science, for example, right? We want to know what is out there in space with the satellites and the rockets. We want to see how matter really looks from the inside. So we develop microscopes to look into it, right? And we want to see how our organ works and the body, right? So we look into it, and we develop permanently instruments to know more, to see more, to reach deeper. And technology also makes the world available. You see it in transport technologies, right? Starting with a bicycle, right? When you get a bike, the horizon of what is available to you, or accessible or attainable, that's AAA, available, accessible, attainable. This horizon increases with a bike, and then it increases with a car, and it increases with a plane, right? And that's what drives us, and it drives us all the way to the smartphone. Because if you own a smartphone, right, then all the knowledge in the world, if it has been digitalized, is just one click away. And all your friends are one click away. And all the music you want to listen, it's always just one click away. And this is making the world available, accessible, attainable. And this, I think, is very strong motivation that even explains why money could become so important. You know, Simmel's question. Right?
Absolutely.
Why is money attractive? Because if you have a lot of money, then you have the world available. You can afford going places, or buying a flat, or even going helicopter skiing or something like that.
Absolutely.
So you have to understand this in order to understand how the system as a whole is working. And I believe in the 18th century you have this dual movement, right? Institutions move. Like in the economy, of course, it becomes capitalistic, but also in science, for example, right? That we permanently try to push the border of science, and even in the arts, that art is no longer mimetic, somehow being true to nature, or some styles of the ancients.
The Aristotelian concept of art,
But the art, the achievement in art is innovation, going beyond what others did before. So I believe around the 18th century there was this shift in the fabric of modern society, from a kind of more adaptive stabilization or even protective stabilization, where you just try to keep what you have, to this form of dynamic stabilization, right? You only stabilize yourself, even in politics, right? Through permanent increase, politicians have to promise creating more jobs.
Yeah. This is part of the...
Yes, and of course they have to be re-elected every 4 or 5 years or so, right? So that's dynamic stabilization. So there's this shift, and on the cultural plane there is the shift towards the AAA conception of the good life, and that two reinforce each other.
I see. I see. That's very interesting. And this leads to alienation, you say, no? I mean, we could talk a little bit more about what are the consequences of this modern, accelerated society in terms of maybe new pathologies that we see out there, you know, which have become worldwide, no? Pandemias, I don't know in English, like, you understand, like burnout and many other psychological problems as well.
Exactly.
Do you see a connection between your diagnosis of modernity and these forms of
pathologies,
or malaise?
Very, very much so. I really believe that this modern program is in serious crisis, and actually that it necessarily leads to a whole series of crises, right? And interestingly, I mean, what we just did, you can look at it from a kind of structural side or from a cultural side again, when you look at the pathological problems. I mean, one of my takes is that this logic of dynamic stabilization, of increasing the speed or accelerating, it creates problems of what I call desynchronization, because you cannot dynamize all parts of the world, right? So I really believe that the ecological crisis, for example, can be interpreted, or not interpreted, it is essentially a crisis of desynchronization. Nature is too slow for us, right? We extract raw materials, right, at a pace which is too high for it to regrow. We cut down the forests at a pace which is too high, or fish the oceans, and we pollute the air. And even what we call global warming is in fact a kind of accelerating the atmosphere, but this creates desynchronization to the ecosphere further down below. Right?
The particles themselves.
The particles
accelerate.
move faster. It's the physical energy we need. We need to get the dynamic stabilization game going.
So not only human beings accelerate.
No, that's exactly true. I mean, that's exactly what I mean. I mean, heating the atmosphere is making molecules move faster, and this is a consequence of social speed being too high for a kind of a climatic.
Nature cannot keep up, so to speak.
That's the thing. It's desynchronized, and I believe you see it on other levels too. Like on democracy, for example, is too slow for the speed of economic developments and technological change, and even for the speed of media exchange, right? Because the idea is always that you have to have fast solutions. That's what politicians even tell you, right? You have to have fast answers to problems, and media tell you the same. But democracy is a time-consuming process, right? Democracy is not about taking a decision. I find this really important. I mean, democracy only lives. It's an idea you find in Habermas, for example. Right? It only lives if you have a kind of public opinion formation. And what we do right now very often is kind of polling, right? And even politicians do it. They see what they ask people's convictions, and then they try to come up with policies which are successful in that kind of area. But this is only aggregating private opinion, right? Democracy is the idea that you formulate different positions and visions and attitudes.
Deliberation.
And then you enter into a process of deliberation and negotiation, which transforms the original views, right, and the original positions in order to reach some form of collective shaping of the world. And this is time-consuming. And my diagnosis actually is, I call this the pathology of political time, that democracy needs more time if the world is complex and if society is pluralistic, right? If it's less conventional and traditionalistic. So politics would actually need more time, but they have, politicians and the political system has less time because there are more decisions to be taken, and they have to be taken anew all the time because the world changes quickly and it's very complex. But there's also this kind of, so that's the structural flip side, right? Desynchronization. But there's also this kind of cultural pathology, which I think is a very interesting flip side of this process, actually of the AAA idea. You know, the idea is that you make the world available, accessible, attainable. But it seems that while we try to make this and we really get access to many things, it somehow turns cold or gray or silent. You lose it. Right? I think modernity on the cultural side has this fear. It's driven. There is one deep fear, one existential fear in modern life, and that is that we might lose the world. I mean, the idea is to really grip it, grasp it, appropriate it. And the experience is that this process of appropriation might actually lead to alienation, right? We get it, we have it, we control it, but it doesn't speak to us anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, you see this in Marx's early, actually you see it even in Jean-Jacques Rousseau's conception of alienation, right? Where he says all the progress, civilizational and technological, leads to to a state of affairs where we lose our sense for nature, for our own nature and for each other, right? And but then you also see it in Marx, of course, where he says we're alienated from the process of work, from the product of work, but also from nature and from each other, and in the end from ourselves.
Exactly.
Right? And you have the diagnosis in Max Weber, disenchantment. As the backside of the. And you have it in Simmel when he talks about the late, he calls it blasé attitude towards the world, right? You become totally cool. You're no longer really impressed or touched by what's going on out there.
So that's a paradox, no? Because
yes, of course.
On the one hand, all these modern processes have made, as you said, the world available to us. So we would say we can appropriate many more things than 200 years ago.
Yeah,
For example, I have more music on my smartphone, and I have many more things available, commodities, of course, at home. So what kind of appropriation are you talking about that we are losing?
Yeah, I mean, that's the interest. I mean, that's
in the meantime.
Yeah, I think that's the philosophical and also the cultural challenge. I really believe. I mean, when you look at the political world, there's so much anger out there in almost all over the world, right? I mean, there's anger and even hatred and resentment, right? And I would somehow go with Blumenberg. I mean, very often this resentment or this anger has very clear-cut economic reasons. I mean, there is poverty, right, or disprivileging and inequality in the world. But it's in the very rich countries and cultures which really profit a lot from the global inequalities, like the US or Germany, right? You find a lot of anger in the streets. And I mean, the people who voted Trump, for example, into office, they weren't the poorest of the United States and certainly not the poorest in the world, right? I mean, very often it's kind of middle class driven. Yeah. So I agree with Blumenberg, who says there is a disappointment that somehow life is not delivering its promise, right? Something is wrong there. So we are disappointed, and Blumenberg says, well, then we have to go back and ask ourselves, well, what was the promise, right? What was it that we hoped life would give us and it doesn't give us? And I mean, you know, a lot of people have the huge TV screen and maybe even the house and the car, and they are still totally angry.
Of course.
And I think they direct the anger at the wrong place. I mean, they feel alienation, and they think it must be the aliens, I mean, the foreigners who are responsible.
Right.
I mean, you see this very strongly in Germany.
The refugees.
We almost have no foreigners, right? And particularly in places where there are no foreigners at all, people think that they have all the right, the reason for their frustrations are the aliens, right? While in fact
they feel threatened.
Yes, but so I think they are alienated, but not by the aliens, right? By the immigrants, so to speak. So what is it? And this, of course, is the philosophical and the cultural challenge. That this, I call it this sense of this. There's an interesting line of thinking which comes from Max Scheler and then to Herbert Marcuse, who says that the flip side of both of the logic of dynamic stabilization, right? Accelerate, innovate, grow, and of the logic of the AAA turns the world in a kind of in a field of points of aggression, right? In our everyday lives, everything that we approach or encounter is somehow a cause for aggression. I want to have this. I need to buy this. I need to control this, or I want to go there, right? So the world kind of appears, particularly in the to-do list, right? All of us, I mean, in the Western or in the so-called developed or half-developed countries, people have a long, particularly middle-class people, long lists, to-do lists, right? And this is the kind of how you experience life as a series of points of aggression. You have to get this done. I need to buy this, to repair this, to do this, to control this, and to acquire this. Yeah. And this is a certain way of relating to the world, where we lose something, right? Actually, Adorno would say, where we lose the possibility for real experience and encounter.